thank you for joining me today on another PDPM Prepare, Plan, and Perform webinar. Today, I thought what we would talk about, as the title suggests, is breaking down the speech component, which really I don't think has probably gotten enough attention with a lot of what we read and the things that we are doing to try and prepare for PDPM in October. So what we're going to do is talk briefly, as I start all of these out, just briefly about the different PDPM components and really understand the formula, the base rate, and the CMI on how the speech component is determined. We're going to talk about some of the things that impact that CMI, specifically comorbidities, talk about the BIM score and how that impacts, and the BIMS and CPS together specifically as well. And then we still have some unknowns with the speech component, and I'm going to give you all an update as to what those are and possibilities of what that looks like in the future. So again, as I say in all of mine, you know, this is the information that I'm sharing with you all is what we know as of today, and I do anticipate a few things that I'm going to be discussing to change. So I've left the CMS website at the end of the screen, the handouts that I will be sharing, and so be sure there's a PDPM website that CMS has done a really nice job of updating us on different fact sheets and updates. So, you know, always be on the lookout for anything that they put out. So the first thing that I am going to do is I'm going to try my best to download this. I have a polling question that you guys should be seeing. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that. It says the SLP component of PDPM can only be paid if speech services are received by that patient 5 times a week. So let me open the poll here, and you guys can answer a true or false. I'm not going to give you the answer to this until a little bit later. So I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of time. I'm seeing the numbers still moving, so I'm going to give you guys just a few more seconds. And again, we're going to go over this at the end. Give you guys about 10 more seconds. Still moving a little bit. True, false. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and we're going to keep moving on. You've got, it takes just about 15 more seconds for everything to close down, so give me just a minute here. I always think it's good to test and see what everybody's knowledge base is going in. So the majority of you, it looks like you put false, and there are also some people that answer true. So majority is false on this one, and again, we're going to cover this at the end. So next, again, just to reiterate, you know, PDPM is payment change only. Criteria for skilled services do not change. So we still need therapy 5 times a week if the patient is being skilled for therapy. If the patient's being skilled for nursing, it has to be a daily skill. So again, I always like to refresh everyone's minds when it comes to that, because nothing in the benefit policy manual as of today has changed in that regard. And so here, as you all know, is what the PDPM payment model looks like. I enlarged the speech CMI, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. But as you know, there are 6 components, and 5 of them have CMIs attached, and then there is a non-case mix component that doesn't change. And then from just a very visual perspective, this is what it looks like. So for speech, we have a base rate, and then we have a CMI that's associated with that. The base rate, for the most part, we've got one for urban here listed and also one for rural, 2215. And again, that could change certainly according to where you are in your geography, but that is for the urban, and 2790 for rural, and that is the base rate for speech. So in digging down as to how the case mix is determined, there are several things that determine the CMI for speech. and we're going to go through these. We're going to look at the primary reason for SNF, admission and care, cognitive status, the presence of swallowing disorder or mechanically altered diet, and then other speech-related comorbidities. Okay, so I've got one more polling question for you. Give me just a second. And I'm going to download. And again, we're going to cover this here in just a few minutes. And I am going to open the poll. In order to qualify for the cognitive impairment category of PDPM, a dementia diagnosis must be confirmed on the chart. And again, we're going to cover these both at the end, but as we're digging into the CMI, I just want to test your all's knowledge base. And I'll give you guys about 10, 15 more seconds. It's another true false. Trying to make this a little more interactive so you guys don't fall asleep during my presentations. Good job. Lots of people answering. I really appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It takes about 15, 20 seconds for it to completely close. And again, we're going to go over that toward the end. If you haven't put a response in, do it quickly. Okay, and again, that question relates to the specific category for the CMI, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so as we are looking at the CMI, there are a couple of different steps in the way I have divided it out as to how we determine the CMI. So the first step, and I'm calling it step 1A, because step 1 actually has several different questions with it. It's the presence of a diagnosis being either an acute neurodiagnosis or a non-neurodiagnosis. That comes solely from I-20B or I-0020B from the MDS. And that is the new section of the MDS that is going to be added in October. It's not on the MDS right now. And the question for that is going to essentially say, what is the primary reason for admission to the SNF? Whatever diagnosis is put in there will fall into one of the 10 primary diagnosis clinical categories that you see here in the boxes on your right. Those 10 categories that you see listed are also the same 10 that you see with PT and OT. They are both PT and OT subdivide, and so does the speech component. So all of them fall into a clinical category. They are further divided into another clinical category. For speech specifically, all of these fall into non-neuro or acute neuro. And you can see from a clinical category perspective, only the acute neurodiagnoses fall into the acute neuro category. And so I've given an example here. There is, many of you may be aware, there is a mapping Excel spreadsheet that CMS has provided with a lot of ICD-10 codes that you can go and look up. And so I just did a cut and paste on some that are defined as acute neurologic. I listed these specifically for a SNF. The D, the ICD-10 category with the D on the end would most likely be the diagnosis that would occur in the SNF because it's a subsequent encounter. So on this one, if we were to have a patient admitted with incomplete lesion of unspecified level of lumbar spinal cord subsequent encounter, that would qualify for an acute neurodiagnosis. This one specifically as well, you can see on the snippet, there is also another question that talks about whether or not they had any type of major procedure or surgery. So this patient may be eligible for one of the 2 surgery categories as well. CMS has not given us a good listing yet of what those surgeries are. There are different checkboxes in the proposed draft MDS, but we're not exactly sure what diagnosis would make you eligible or not. So I think there is definitely more to come from a mapping perspective on that. So as we put the diagnosis in I-20B, and it falls into acute neuro or non-neuro. The second part of this step is to determine whether the patient has one or more of these comorbidities. they have given us 12 comorbidities listed. Each of these comorbidities, if we further take a deep dive into them, they're all from the MDS. So all of those 12 that we just saw and that are on the list in front of you come from MDS responses. You can see that the majority of them fall under Section I, which is the diagnosis section. Some of them are check boxes. The I-4300 aphasia, for example, is a check box. But you can see at the bottom, the ones that I have in purple are in the I-8000 category. And so those are ones that we would enter in. There is much more to come in this area, because if you can see on the I-8000 apraxia and the I-8000 dysphagia and the speech language deficits at the bottom, the diagnosis codes that they have given us that would qualify a patient under these I-8000 codes are unspecified codes, and we're actually not supposed to use them. So the I-69.9XX codes that are listed on here that they have provided for us are actually we're not even supposed to be using. So just to let you all know, I actually sent an email to the PDPM mailbox about this, saying, you know, there are a lot of dysphagia and apraxia and other speech codes that are very more specific that we should be able to utilize in order for a patient to qualify for these comorbidities. I did get a response from them that said that they are updating their diagnosis listing and that there are more diagnoses coming. So just know that. But if you look up right now on their website as to what qualifies a patient and under those purple areas, the I-69.9 codes hopefully will be updated. So I wanted you guys to be aware of that, and hopefully, you know, again, much more to come. Now, the two cancer diagnoses, the categories, there are multiple cancer diagnoses listed under that. And you can also see that there are two under Section O, which is trach care and ventilator while they're a resident. So those also are check boxes, but they aren't under I, they're under Section O. So again, much more to come on this. We're going to have to be on the lookout for what diagnosis will qualify a patient to fall under one of these comorbidities. I also wanted to talk for a minute. One of the things I do like to do is when I review a section on the MDS, it's really important to look at intent and how the REI manual defines the sections. So I wanted to know how they looked at Section I for our purposes in looking at PDPM. And there are actually two different criteria or lookbacks for Section I. And again, this potentially could be updated. I don't think it will, but this is what it says today. So first of all, that there has to be a physician-documented diagnosis in the last 60 days to qualify under Section I. And then you have to determine whether it's active or inactive within the 7-day look back. And there is one exception with UTI you can see there. I'm not going to read through all of this. It's here for a resource for you. But just know that they did talk about the fact that an active diagnosis has to have a direct relationship to the resident's current functional, cognitive, mood, or behavior status. And it also talks about it has to impact their current plan of care. So as you're looking and determining whether or not a diagnosis is active or inactive, be sure to look at the REI manual and make sure that you are coding it appropriately. So we have looked at diagnosis, acute neuro or non-neuro. We have looked at some of the comorbidities, and so the third part of this step is to determine cognitive impairment. And so what I wanted to say about this is that it is strictly based on Section C of the MDS. So it doesn't matter where a patient has an Alzheimer's diagnosis, it doesn't, and this is one of the questions we just went through, it doesn't matter whether the physician has diagnosed a patient with dementia, it is based strictly on Section C of the MDS. So for all of you who may be resident assessment coordinators out there, you know that the BIMS is a big part of Section C. I had included a YouTube link. This also came out in one of our Partnership First email blasts. It's several years old, but the BIMS hasn't changed really, and it's a really nice, quick video on how to properly perform a BIMS. So if the patient is able to perform the BIMS, you can see that there is a score here on the slide. If the patient is unable to complete the BIMS, you then move to the cognitive performance scale. So as you all know, you get an outcome score based on one of those. And this is how it looks in regards to qualifying a patient for impairment under PDPM. So if they have anything beyond cognitively intact, then it's considered a cognitive impairment. And you can see my note on there. So a mild, moderate, or severe impairment based on their score would qualify a patient to determine whether or not they're cognitively impaired. So I included the chart that CMS incorporated in determining this. So Section C is, you know, it's always been important, but certainly it's going to get a lot more attention with the incorporation of PDPM. So now we talked about the neuro, we talked about the comorbidities, and we talked about whether or not a patient has a cognitive impairment. We choose none, 1, 2, or 3. Okay, that's step 1. Then we're going to take a look and see a couple of other things under step 2. There are 2 parts to step 2. The first one is determining whether or not there's a swallowing disorder. And again, based solely on MDS response. It is from section K, K0100A through D. CMS says that if they have one of these conditions during the look back, while they've been a resident or a patient of the facility, then you would check this off. And again, it's loss of liquids. These are signs and symptoms of swallowing disorder, right? They're holding food, they're coughing or choking, they make complaints of difficulty or pain with swallowing. So if the, again, patient shows any of those, you can check it off and it would be determined that the patient does have a swallowing disorder. Again, a couple of more coding tips that come from the REI manual. We are not supposed to code a swallowing problem if interventions have been successful and therefore the signs and symptoms didn't occur. So what that means is that if the patient has a history of dysphagia, but they have been on a specialized diet, for example, that they have been able to tolerate and do not show signs and symptoms because the diet that they're on has been successful, then if they don't show those signs and symptoms, we don't actually check Section K. And we can code them even if it only occurred once during that 7-day look-back period. So again, coding tips, REI manual definitions are always important for us to really understand. Second part of step 2 is whether or not the patient is on a mechanically altered diet. Again, comes straight from the MDS. Mechanically altered diet, Section K, mechanically altered diet while a resident. And so here's the coding tips from the REI manual. And so it's any type of mechanically altered diet. It's a change in texture of food or liquids since they have been admitted. Okay, so check all nutritional approaches after admission, entry, or reentry, and within the 7-day look-back period. So an example of that may be that the patient comes in and they're on a regular diet, but speech doesn't avow and says, you know, no, they're showing signs and symptoms of some swallowing problems. We're going to put them on a mechanical soft, thick and liquid diet. If that has occurred in the 7-day look-back, then you can then check it. So here we go. Swallowing disorder, yes or no. Mechanically altered diet, all based on sections of the MDS. That's either, neither, or both. So here's what the CMI looks like for speech. Again, we've got the column on the very left that we talked about, the 3 steps. The middle column talks about, it's got 2 steps, the mechanically altered diet or swallowing disorder, and then you get a case mixed group with a CMI attached to it. You can note, though, that if they don't have any symptoms from either of the columns, that the CMI would actually drop you below the base rate. So that if they have no signs and symptoms and are not coded on the MDS on the areas that we talked about, your base rate could potentially drop even from the base rate of what PDPM gives us. So that 0.68 would actually bring you down a little bit. So we always want to make sure and code accurately. I'm going to go through a really quick case study. This was actually a patient that they put into the final rule, and we're just going to quickly walk through it. So this patient has an acute neurologic diagnosis. I put some check marks here. They do not have any comorbidities. I know there's a lot here on this graph. And they do have a cognitive impairment. So that's step one, right? So they've got 2 of the 3 listed. On this other part 2, or step 2, they have no swallowing disorder, but they are on a mechanically altered diet. So if we take a look, they are under any 2, and then they were either. They have an SH CMI with a CMI of 2.85. I took a rural base rate, I multiplied it, and that would give you $79.51 a day for that resident based on coding. Okay, so just quick summary. I've got just a couple more slides to go over with you all. You know, don't forget that regardless of whether or not the patient is receiving speech therapy, there is still a CMI attached to it, and your facility will receive those dollars every day, just like with every component. And again, that was one of the questions that we talked about at the very beginning. But regardless of whether speech is being received, depending on how the coding is, you still would receive that speech component that is added up with the other components to give you a daily rate for that patient. So preparation, we've talked about a lot of these, but just a quick summary, preparation is always key. Getting that diagnosis right on admission. What is the primary reason for admission to the SNF? That I-20B going to be a new area on the MDS starting October 1. Capturing those comorbidities and diagnoses, making sure that they're active, and capturing them appropriately under Section I, also really key for speech. You know, that BIMS score, CPS score, review that video. Make sure that you're accurately assessing to make sure that the scoring is correct on that. If you've got speech involved or if the patient isn't able to perform the BIMS, you know, get some feedback from some of the other team members in order to accurately capture the CPS. Section K, vital for swallowing and also what type of diet. And you guys are doing the right thing by going through PDPM training now. So, you know, preparation is important in trying to get everything ready and prepared for October 1. So here was our first polling question, and we've gone through this. But speech component can only be paid if speech services are received. The answer to that, and the majority of you answered, is false. It's going to be paid based on how the MDS is coded and will give us a daily rate regardless of whether or not speech is being received. That's part of the new structure of our payment with PDPM. And then in order to qualify for the cognitive impairment category, under the speech component, a dementia diagnosis must be confirmed on the chart. That one also is false. We learned that it is based on either the BIMS or the CPS from the MDS. And this concludes our session today. I always like to end by saying stay focused on the patient because that's what we do best. And as long as we do that, everything else will fall into place. So thank you for joining me today. I will get the video of this out soon, and your area directors will have the handouts that they can share with you. Thanks so much for joining us.